Is Mr. Sean O'Conline, agus Falteroiv Galer, goodie our webinar, Tranone. Good evening, everybody. You're very, very welcome to this, what we hope is going to be a special evening. You'll see as we go through it that we're attempting something that's very special. It's a special occasion. Contormi fin da hangachas agus ga chultur, how to imagine problems becoming possibilities. Ferkend oit le in our sail changa. In a way, shining a light on the importance of a minority language, on Gaeilge. English speakers who don't understand Irish need to be patient as we explore, while native speakers of Irish and of course, we hope to take a small step in envisioning how the over 1.8 million people in Ireland, according to the last sentence, claim to have an ability to speak the language and how they can be tempted to speak it. Of course, this is all in the context of a new social imaginary in Ireland, and also in the overall realm of well-being.
Welcome everyone to this webinar. It's lovely to see so many people here. My name is Caroline White and I'm an ecological economist, and I'm one of the core members of the We All Ireland Hub, Wellbeing Economy Ireland Hub, along with Sean and others. And we're here on behalf of FASTA, the Foundation for the Economics of Sustainability. And I think Sean's just going to say a little word about the meaning of FASTA before we carry on.
Indeed, and of course, as usual in Irish, there's a story. Most Irish people can relate to poem and song, and to this particular one, which lamented the passing of the House of the Butlers in Kilcash. I'm going to say the first few lines in Irish. Cad a dhéanamid fasta gan aimid, had deran na gailte lár, níl trocht Kilcash na tailach. Is ni cling for a cling gebrach. So the poem has resonance today as we try to find our way through and from all the crises which surround us. At the time, the poet was lamenting the passing of a way of life, and the allegory was that he said the trees are being cut down. What are we going to do from now on, henceforth? Peadar the Gaelter Lords, the end of the woods. So we address all these crises, hopefully with a new sense of creativity and imagination, just as they did more than 200 years ago.
Yes, and it's not just the question of the woods being cut down, of course, that's a big part of it, but also we have all kinds of environmental limits we're hitting against and all kinds of economic problems, and yet we still have an economy that's very directed towards expansion and growth as a goal. And I was listening in on the National Economic Dialogue this morning in Ireland, and all the three of the major politicians in Ireland were basically just very focused on growth. Whereas in our hub and in the Wellbeing Economy Alliance globally, we're looking at ways to get away from growth as a goal and to look towards well-being instead. How best to find ways to really flourish and to enjoy culture, diversity, the most important things in life within ecological boundaries, within planetary boundaries. And so we do some work on policy work and things like how to measure progress better, how to get away from dependence on fossil fuels, these sorts of things. But we also think it's really, really important to look at the cultural end of things, narrative, the way that we think about what progress is and the stories we tell each other about what progress is. And it's also a big focus of the president in Ireland, Michael D. Higgins, and we're fans of his. And Sean, did you want to say a word about Michael D. as well?
Yes, indeed. I think Michael D. surprised many, particularly economists, recently with his insights into the role of economics in our lives. Is fila fialsoni agus socholie mihal agus is tóca gur sinan fa gwil mas comor in airing agus harlar. We've noticed that people abroad have taken note of what Michael D. had to say about those aspects of economics, and he's perceived as being a leader in this field. We particularly liked a question that he asked.
Yep, the question was, and this was at a recent speech in April, he said, can we recover the required space, the freedom to craft a much needed new economic discourse, a discourse that will be responsive both to the fundamental needs and aspirations of our citizens and to our global responsibilities in relation to our planet and such defining challenges as famine, hunger and mass migration. And the Wellbeing Economy Ireland Hub, we see our role as helping to create that space and freedom that the President describes. We're aiming to shift popular narratives around the purpose of the economy, synthesizing and disseminating knowledge and evidence about what a wellbeing economy looks like, and galvanizing an island-wide and inclusive platform through a creative, intergenerational and intercultural dialogue, while engaging with a global network of peers, because there's a whole group there's a whole network of groups around the world working on these things. And I'd really like to emphasize the words inclusive and intercultural here. We see an Ireland that's culturally diverse, that's our vision, and which celebrates many different heritages. And the Hub also aims to draw on the island's unique cultural, linguistic and intellectual and ecological resources. And I'm going to pass back to you there, Sean, to talk a bit more about that.
Yeah, well, every culture, I think, is proud of what they have, but Ireland is perhaps a little bit special. Gné has several of winning leis chultur gailach. Our own culture, logantacht, scéalaíocht and ceol and mitasolaíocht mar hampla. So these are indeed treasures that we have and that can enhance our well-being.
So tonight's, sorry, were you done, Sean? You okay?
Yeah. Yes, I'm done. Yeah, go
You're
ahead.
Done. Okay. So tonight's webinar, it's an experiment with language because language is such an important part of culture. So we'll be hearing both Irish and English, as we already have, because we're trying to explore different approaches to minority languages and bilingualism. So those of us in this group today who are bilingual and comfortable with Irish and English will use both languages. And those of us who aren't will hear the English and understand enough English to get a good idea of the conversation. That's me, by the way, I'm included in that. So it's we thought it was very, very important to make it possible to hear the Irish language and not cover it up with a simultaneous translation, because you lose a lot of nuance and insight with translation, and it's good to hear the music of the original language. So it's an experiment tonight, and we'll see how it goes. I think it should be very, very interesting. I'm going to pass on to Peadar now, who's going to explain a little bit more about our We All Ireland Culture and Creatives project.
Thank you very much, Sean and Caroline. You're very welcome, everyone. And I'm just going to say a little bit about the specific context or program for tonight's session. We're very pleased to say that we have been supported by Carnegie UK in pursuing a conversation that came very early whenever the hub formed across the island of Ireland. This hub that is part of a global network of activists, academics, even governments now, cultivating a conversation at the intersections of the well-being economy, degrowth, post-development, new visions of the good life coming from places like Latin America, for example, Buen Vivir. So one of the founders of the movement, Catherine Trebeck, said that one of the core missions, if you like, is a transition to cultivate a shift away from the dominant economic narratives or social imaginaries, and to promotion of new and compelling new narratives. And that's also about recognizing the emergent narratives that are already occurring across the island in places and some of our national conversations. In the degrowth literature, Latouche and Castorides talk about the decolonisation of the social imaginary. They say that this sort of revolution requires profound changes in the psychosocial structure of people in the Western world, in their attitude toward life, in short, in their imaginary. And today, of course, it's communities, even parts of government, and certainly movements, critical movements in places like Latin America, who are challenging the dominant imaginary that sits behind the materialization of the ideas that have come out of the European modern project and have been foisted on different parts of the world through processes of empire building and colonization. So this is not a naive reimagining. It's one that is also linked to our commitment to building a community of practice for artists, for creatives, writers, intellectuals, movements, to intervene across the island to help cultivate, shape, and give recognition to those new narratives for a well-being economy. So it's linked to movement building, and it's linked also to recognizing, empowering, and cultivating connections and relationships with place-based initiatives, a bit like the eco-village, of course, in Cloughjordan, where our speaker is now based. I'd like to just finish. I mean, Sean says that Ireland occupies a special position. The island, of course, served as a template for the vast systems change that went under the names of colonization, the plantations. That was an ecological transformation, as well as a societal, economic, and cultural imposition. In looking deeply then into our own histories, languages, experiences of power, and revisiting our understanding of colonization as a profound socio-ecological imposition, which it involved everything from extractivism to the experience of exile in terms of our language and our displacement from place. We hope, therefore, to spur a movement on the island and make a significant contribution by interpolating the We All global mission through our lens of our own experience, our own imaginaries on the island. Our speaker tonight is a former professor of international politics at the University of Limerick, Peadar Kirby. He's an educator, an activist scholar working at the intersections of the low carbon transition, degrowth, equality, and spirituality. And of course, he's embedded as a scholar activist in the Cloughjordan community. I first encountered Peadar's work through our shared and long-standing interest in liberation theology and the application of a liberatory critique of Ireland's political economy. And I believe that a golden thread runs through Peadar's long-standing interest in the politics of Latin America, liberatory visions of politics and spirituality, and his most recent work on the provocations of the climate emergency and just transition. And those connections are most apparent, perhaps, in his most recent book, Karl Polanyi and the Contemporary Political Crisis, Transforming Market Society in the Era of Climate Change. So it's a particular pleasure to hand over to our keynote speaker, Professor Peadar Kirby. Thank you, Peadar.
Good, Peter. So, Idir ga chultur. I'm trying to grasp the challenge of a bilingual event that doesn't resort to simultaneous translation, which presumes that all languages are composed of equivalent meanings. In choosing Idir ga chultur as part of the title, I presumed that even English speakers would grasp what it meant. Certainly French and Spanish speakers would have no difficulty entre deux cultures, entre dos culturas. But in my intention in bringing you on a bilingual journey is refusing to allow the minority language to be marginalized, as happens so often, as it differs again and again to the dominant language. So let us not allow that to happen. It's one everyday aspect of the constant struggle between monoculture and diversity. Indeed, I'm more and more convinced that biodiversity requires linguistic diversity. And in trying to model that diversity, some participants here, as I think is acknowledged in the chat, won't understand everything being said. But as some are already saying, I invite you to savor the sounds as much as understanding the meaning, and hopefully learning some lessons about navigating paradigm change and what our native language offers us. Marshing, araigling, an móthar. Tá trí mhór héalma a gomanacht an teanga inti hain, ahrú paradigma, agus mór achfaní ó hiocht na Gaeilge chun sin a shrórú an malach. So I'm going to deal with three major topics, the language itself, first of all, then moving into the issue of what we mean by paradigm change, and then picking out three, what to me are three core and unique contributions that our Gaelic culture and tradition have to offer to this journey that the whole of humanity, of course, is on now, from the dominant paradigm to a new emerging paradigm. I want to communicate something then to start off with about living Idir Gá chultur. What is it to speak a language, the language of our place and the people who have lived in this place for millennia, but a language which has been forcefully marginalized, had its institutional life destroyed over 400 years ago, been driven underground and treated with derision and disdain by the powerful. And to speak this language under the all-pervasive shadow of the world's most powerful and dominant language, which also happens to be the language of our colonizers. This is not just the Irish experience. This is the experience, indeed, of much of humanity. Perhaps a bit unusual in Europe, as it's been adverted to, but all so-called indigenous peoples, and I hate the term indigenous peoples, live between two cultures, and their songs, their stories, their dances all shout this out. I think it's why the reports of the IPCC and the IPBES again and again emphasize the vital importance of indigenous language and cultures for the task of addressing climate change and biodiversity loss, particularly their understanding of the importance of community and environment. There's a consciousness here of different worlds of meaning and desire. It's not just meaning, it's worlds of desire, of feeling, that's unique to those of us who speak languages constantly under the oppressive and powerful shadow of a dominant language like English. For generations, Irish speakers have lived with the awareness reinforced by the dominant culture of the time that this is a dying language. And this is very painful, making us feel very vulnerable. One of the great difficulties that English carries is the curse of monoglottism, namely that many of its speakers presume that they have to make no effort to speak other people's languages, and it's up to other people to speak their language to them. And furthermore, to borrow a phrase used by Tim Jackson in the last such webinar, English is, he said, stained with the blood of empire. Now, many languages are so stained: French, Spanish, Dutch, Italian, German, Russian. But the experience of speaking a language that has been so actively and forcefully marginalized is that it takes us to very different imaginative spaces. So the daily experience of one living Idir Gá chultur, and we in Irish even write books about it. Here's a book, Idir Gá chultur. I suggest that as we, as humanity indeed, become more and more aware that we are living between two cultures, that is the dominant paradigm, destructive paradigm of growth and extractivism that has already been mentioned, and the emerging paradigm emerging between the spaces and the cracks that are opening up in the dominant paradigm, that our Irish experience then of living Idir Gá chultur takes on a very important and indeed global significance. Tá aiste iontoch ag Liam McCoyle nach ól de bhórán scá ag chéile a bharan na focail a d'ireann sé. Ar nóid tá isaguing fad go maran na daoine scá a chéile. Ach de réir McCoyle sa Gaeilge tá gachrod ceangailte le na chéile, a rian na focail nuair a ceangailítear le focail eile. Ní féidir an duine ina éonar a hawlú sa Gaeilge. I gcónaí Bín síú sé ceangailta le háit nó le daoine eile. Fiú marann sé seo I Maryland na hÉireann, nuair a bhfuiln tú le duine den céadúir sé an céad ceis ná, where are you from? Agus sí an dara ceis ná, then you must know so-and-so. Mar sin is teanga ólíochaí an Gaeilge dá bharr a derma coil. The self-sufficient, neoliberalized individual is really very difficult to imagine and talk about in Irish. We are always connected. We don't even have words for yes and no. The acceptance or refusal of something in Irish must always be connected to the subject being accepted or refused. Nor do we have a verb for possession. We may have the use of things, but the exclusivity and individualism of possession is foreign to the language. And so these are some of the reasons why our leading Irish language novelist Liam McCoyle calls Irish a very ecological language. Now, in saying this, of course, I'm not belittling English. There's nothing anti-English here. We're very lucky in Ireland to speak English fluently. Indeed, we're the envy of many around the world. When I teach in the University of Valencia in Spain, I'm constantly struck by the efforts that the Spaniards are making to learn English in order to be able to write academic articles in English, because that's what's going to get them on in their careers. This comes effortlessly to us. However, I am convinced that the emergence of English as our vernacular language throughout most of the island a little over 100 years ago, and the swift retreat from Irish has left huge wounds, the healing of which we may just be beginning to undertake. So let's now look at the second half of my title. We're navigating paradigm change. There are different access points to the realities of the dominant and the subaltern paradigm. Some entered through the lens of post-colonialism. But at this moment in human history, we were able to understand in a fuller way the nature and implications of the paradigm change now facing all of humanity, about which we no longer have any choice as we address the realities of climate change, biodiversity loss, and the urgent need for radical social transformation. So this is my starting point into the issue of paradigm change. Tim Jackson, in his talk at the last such webinar, fleshed out some of the central elements of his understanding of paradigm change, where we are now, and how where we are now may be blocking our advance to a new paradigm. He quoted Mary Douglas asking, what is the objective of the consumer? And answering that it is to create the social world, to find a credible place in it. Tim adds that the problem now is, and this is his quote, that we're locked into its social logic by our own symbolic attachment to stuff. But if society, as Tim said, hangs on the gossamer thread of collective dreams, the collective dream that dominates is a consumerist one. Isn't that a big part of the problem? Sé an fat title a chormisha again seo ná navigating paradigm change. Cén Gaeilge a chorfa sin, ólas an bhealaigh a aimsú, troracha a áil, ach cá chuige, cá bhfuil our drill, where are we going? From the collective dream of consumerism to a new collective dream, one that we see the contours of only very, very vaguely right now. To me, the best analysis of the dominant paradigm comes from what to some people is a strange source, and that's Pope Francis's encyclical letter Laudato Si. Now, we can go back to the original Spanish version, or we do have a lovely Irish translation of it. But on this paragraph, I think I'll stick with the English translation because I think it does the job better. And this, I think, gets us to the heart of the dominant paradigm. The Pope wrote, it can be said that many problems of today's world stem from the tendency, at times unconscious, to make the method and aims of science and technology an epistemological paradigm which shapes the lives of individuals and the workings of society. The effects of imposing this model on reality as a whole, human and social, are seen in the deterioration of the environment, but this is just one sign of a reductionism which affects every aspect of human and social life. We have to accept that technological products are not neutral, for they create a framework which ends up conditioning lifestyles and shaping social possibilities along the lines dictated by the interests of certain powerful groups. Decisions which may seem purely instrumental are in reality decisions about the kind of society we want to build. And that, I think the Pope is saying something very similar to what Tim Jackson said. It's a vision dominated by a consumerist view of life. And where are we going? The Pope does make an effort a little bit further on to talk about how we can broaden our vision. So he starts with vision as the starting point for the paradigm we're moving to. We have the freedom needed to limit and direct technology, very pertinent today with the debates on AI. We can put it at the service of another type of progress, one which is healthier, more human, more social, more integral. Liberation from the dominant the technocratic paradigm does, in fact, happen sometimes. For example, when cooperatives of small producers adopt less polluting means of production and opt for a non-consumerist model of life, recreation, and community, or when technology is directed primarily to resolving people's concrete problems, truly helping them live with more dignity and less suffering, or indeed, when the desire to create and contemplate beauty manages to overcome reductionism through a kind of salvation, which occurs in beauty and in those who behold it. An authentic humanity, calling for a new synthesis, seems to dwell in the midst of our technological culture, almost unnoticed, like a mist seeping gently beneath a closed door. Arshin Oscliamish Honduras. So it's relatively easy to describe the elements of what this paradigm change is all about, from growth to degrowth, from extraction to regeneration, from linear to circular. I don't particularly see that Irish speakers have anything unique to bring to those topics, though of course we have lots that we can say in Irish about them. I gave a webinar recently on de-os, degrowth. Indeed, I coined the word and I had to fight off the use of de-Herbert, which I argued misunderstood the concept, but that's an aside. There are two dimensions to paradigm change that I want to focus on, and that is the move from the individual to the community and from the global to the local. It's simply not adequate to treat either of these crucial dimensions in the universal, abstract, scientific, and technological terms which are so central to English. These are dimensions that must be rooted in the particular. They need history, belonging, feeling, sensibility. So for the rest of this talk, I want to offer three guardrails, as I call them, from our native tradition that to me are essential to navigating paradigm change for us on this small island. Chean céad ceann ná dúchas. Tosáid mé le dán ó chahal ó Sharkey, ó na leabhar nua an tír ruin. Ina úmpíonn sé a hiorgrach rúchais an counter as fásco ina ruithe crathach agus saolíoch. Tá gríonn sé don gael idir anam agus áit, agus don ceannas ceanna seo a ceanglíonn an duine le dúithe. Agus thríbhainne cíche na gaelge, má híonn sé na glúnta ginnelig ag cúislú anam. Now, I won't even try a translation of this beautiful poem by one of our leading poets, Cahal Ó Sharkey, but instead I'll offer a description in English, which ends up flat and devoid of the emotional charge that it communicates in Irish. The poet transforms his physical native place of Donegal into a creative and imaginative space through exploring the relationship between name and place, the fondness that connects person and place, which through the breast milk of Irish allows the genealogical generations to pulsate in him. It verges On the sentimental in English, it throbs with profound resonances in Irish. Let's apply this to the well-being economy, if I may be so bold in present company as to do so. I'm sure many of us can contribute to a discussion of what it means, but if you ask me to translate it into Irish, I struggle because it's too abstract for the Gaelic mind. When I went to the dictionary, I found the translation for well-being as following, and I thought how wrong that is, how it completely misses some essences of what we're trying to grasp by the meaning of well-being. And I hit upon a much more common and everyday word in Irish, the word slán. We use it to say goodbye. Slán lat, slán a good. May you take slán with you and may you have it, the people who are staying behind. In essence, it's a rich word about levels of well-being that go well beyond what the English word captures, I think. So it's nothing new. The question is, what do we need to do to live in a way that is slán? What might anachnamíocht slán look like? And the one dimension the Gaelic mind will instinctively know is that it's intimately connected, as Cathal O'Sharkey expressed in his poem, to place, to ancestors, to tribe, to security derived from belonging, to health, of course, sláinte, and to spirituality. For those of us who pray and worship in Irish in the Catholic tradition, we meet it all the time. The word slánú is everywhere. We can connect it also to a topic that Moira ní Anrachain finds in some contemporary poetry in Irish, echoes of the connection between the flourishing of nature and the right use of political power. This was strong in Gaelic Ireland. In fact, when I was in Cambodia many years ago, when King Sihanouk was returning after the Pol Pot years, I was amazed to find the local people saying, well, nature will flourish again, the king will be home. So Lergus é seo hefris an ruchish Gaelig in a wilmid biog biauner don chuid is mó. Tá sé har doing filu So what I'm suggesting here is that a deep connection with place, with community, with uncovering the layers of meaning, of feeling, of desire that such an engagement can uncover, helps flesh out in a much fuller way what a well-being economy and society requires. And that this assists greatly the challenge of navigating paradigm change, of giving us some better sense of cá will or drill, where are we going? And this brings me to my second theme of pobl. Back to Jackson's gossamer thread of collective dreams. But let's put the emphasis now not on the dreams, but on the collective. What collective? Again, we're back to the connectivity that connects us, and how might it open us to look anew at the familiar, con ólas an valley a oil, a charoachling, quir con boher. Partly because it was driven underground, Irish is a much more collective language than English, and its culture flourishes collectively. It's very interesting to see the liveliness of poetic composition in Irish today, including rap, and the re-emerging of collective spaces for poetry making akin to the éigsí of the 17th and 18th century. Agus ash go Liam McCoyle, úsáideann sé focail anhever, béascanna, agus is dóil am gurb anan é agus paradigm an bhéirle. Séir de sprí leis dar leis, gréasán tebi a bhún líon agus a ceangalíon, rólanna sóisialta, réimsí ólis agus lochanna rangatha. Fágan an bhéascanna a lorug an duine éanar, an bobl, an númper, agus an glí a smuoiníonn siad. Mar sin can teacht bhéascanna nua, buineann sé le réimsí ólis nua, lochanna nua, agus gréasáin nua, a ceangalíon le chéile, an duine éanar, an pobl, agus an númper. I'm arguing that we have a word in Irish for paradigm that helps us identify what's involved. Values in a ranked sense, social roles, fields of knowledge, and the ways these link and connect the person with the wider society, the ways of thinking and acting that dominate. Probably it's a bit more grounded than Pope Francis. Of course, any language can provide alternatives, but in Ireland, the lens that Irish gives become essential. Sort soile na hintana iad focal na changa, Idir Michael Cronin. The words themselves open our eyes to see our surroundings in a new way and to see new possibilities, possibilities of collective, not individual endeavor. Irish does not allow, it cannot conceive of these possibilities as purely individual. So let's look at our capital city through these new eyes that Michael speaks of. And these examples come from Michael. Ballia á Haclia is the city of the ford of the wattle frame. Dublin is the Black Pool. Nassau Street is Shroud Hubber Foric, nothing to do with the orange royal house of the Netherlands, which is what it comes from. And Phoenix Park, of course, is Park on Ion Ishka, the bright water. So there's water everywhere. As Michael says, Dublin in Irish is another Venice, really, linking us to the reality of water, too much of it and not enough of it, a central issue emerging with the crisis of the dominant paradigm. These are the meanings and connections central to being part of a pobble, not isolated individuals. We can't have collective dreams without this connectivity. And my third theme is ashling, and it takes me to this wonderful book by Gregory Claes on utopianism for a dying planet. He traces the imposition of the collective dreams of consumerism on society, and he locates the greatest challenge for humanity as being how to foster a culture of sociability that alone can wean us off our intense consumerism. Conas pobble a chahu. But what Glace doesn't advert to is the linguistic dimensions of this dominant culture, the advertising industry, the development of the shopping mall, all happened first in the US and the UK. Tá chultur an tóltakish, fitche foiche, leis an merle gepriva, ke goel I chonachar la hand, fud fod na crinne anish. So Glace advises a return to the utopian tradition, from which for 500 years has been the principal source of critiquing luxury and the inequality that fuels it, seeking a society that lives simply in equality, both with each other and with nature. And what most people, such as Glace and even many Irish speakers, don't realize is the rich utopian tradition that exists in Irish poetry and song, what we call the ashling, the vision poetry, an ashling follichul, the political vision. Ceapan an chuid gailgóirí gwyl tradiisiún na hashlinga an camadach, féchan sheer na stewardtig, I thiocach can na gaile úscant rud arnoi nor horla. Ach an auli atá, Cauríon taide bhraundáin I bhóchale ling an tradiisiún seo a hiiscint bhaun eile, mar go gahíonn sé commas marachtáil as dain saolíoch eile, gan bheith gafa ag an gcóras mar atá sé faoi láthair, ach dóchas a bheith going go bhféit faoi ahrú ó bhaun, chun saol I wadní is far a chathú don phobal. Le rion ó bóchale gur chaithigh sé tuiscint folliitiúil furlahan I meascan na Gael I bhábhar réamhlóid na Franca, nuair a tharla sé agus nuair a tháinig sé ar an bhód I 1789. As I say, the ashling tradition of seeing Ireland as a beautiful woman seeking a prince, Prince Bonnie, Prince Charlie, of course, to come to free her from the oppression of Protestant English rule, has been seen as a very conservative tradition. But as interpreted by Brown O'Bochela, who has done extensive work on it, we can now see it as the capacity to live outside the dominant system in an imaginative way. Indeed, the scathing critique of the dominant system that characterizes the ashling is something from which we could all learn, while keeping alive the expectation, the firm expectation of transformative and liberating change. So I suggest we need a similar capacity in our times for the transition we are undergoing. So Mar Ockle Square, I'm proposing here that essential aspects of paradigm change require a deep engagement with place and with community in its many dimensions. For those of us who live on this little island, this cannot happen with any depth if we don't re-engage substantially with the possibilities offered by the language spoken here for over 2 millennia, a language showing rude signs of vigor and health today, even as many dismiss it as useless and irrelevant. I sum up 3 of the contributions it can offer as duchas, hobble, ashling. These are the guardrails Irish gives for the transition. I hesitate to translate these words because to do so, I think, is to lose a lot of their rich particularity. So I've opted more to describe them and to hopefully open them up for you. So let the journey begin. Cuirmush Chunbalig.
Okay, Dermisha, Caroline, Gurmil Magat, Peadar, Paint Duntach Shin. Ta just again, the road again we just omitted at the start to explain the structure of this evening, which I just want to explain a little bit now. So we're about to have responses from Professor Mary Murphy and Ona Cunnagain, and that'll be followed hopefully by some input from yourselves, from everybody. So we're encouraging you, as we put in the chat a couple of times, to put your thoughts, reflections, reactions to put them in the chat. We'll then have a short reflection from Kathleen Ihulawine, who's a native speaker in Kirkcaldy. She's having a little bit of internet difficulty on and off, so hopefully she'll be there. And we'll have another input from our friend Kevin from the Playhouse in Derry. So that's the structure. So now I'm going to hand over to Caroline, who will introduce Professor Mary Murphy.
Thanks, Sean, and thanks very much to Peadar for a very, very interesting talk. For those who came in a little late, this is all being recorded, so you'll find it all on the We All Hub website, the We All Ireland Hub website after, and I'll put a link in the chat. So I'm delighted to invite our first respondent, Professor Mary Murphy. She's the head of the Department of Sociology and a professor as well in the Department of Sociology in Maynooth University, and she has research interests in eco-social welfare, gender, care and social security, globalization and welfare states, and power and civil society. And she's written various publications. Recently, she has a book called Creating an Eco-Social Future that just come out. And she's an active advocate for social justice and gender equality, and was appointed to the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission. And currently she's a member of the Council of State in Ireland. So Mary, over to you. Thanks very much.
Good morning. Tommy Conchas Berla. So I can. Peadar, it's very, very difficult to follow you, but thank you very much. Thank you, first of all, for the opportunity to speak here and for the challenge to really think outside of everyday thinking that I would do and to try and engage with what you said. I suppose I'm coming as like a professor of sociology, but I'm also I'm conscious I'm on the board of Oxfam Ireland and St. Stephen's Green Trust, which is an all-island institution engaging in cross-border activity around poverty and inequality. So I want to try and bring in that kind of experience as well. And I'll just start off by saying, I suppose, yeah, I mean, totally agree with you that languages are not composed of equivalent meanings. And I think you really demonstrate the value of that as a starting point. But my own experience of working through the dominant language of English is that even within one language, there is huge contestation of dominant meanings. And I come to that from recently being in a very significant debate between people who were very coherently for degrowth and sustainability, but who really cared little about democracy as an underpinning vehicle through which to arise it. And I'm very conscious myself of how siloed the debate is between those who advocate around welfare and those who advocate around siloed. So as well as deep narrative that I think you're arguing for there, I really think we need to insist on very deep listening to those narratives and not to assume that there are commonalities across us, because sometimes we have to work quite hard to find them. So I come to this very much as an ecofeminist, and I wanted to try and draw some parallels, as Peadar has used with language, that I can use with ecofeminism, which does stress a lot that focus on alternative knowledges, on Indigenous knowledge, and on particularly gendered knowledge as a contribution to different ways of understanding. And maybe just starting with the word care, because I think it's just really interesting. It's a word that's increasingly, ironically, commodified and trademarked, the feminist Nancy Falber has observed. But if we look at how narrow the word is as a vehicle for us to try and understand the challenge of meeting care, we self-care, care of and for others, care of nature. The concept of care is even deeply contested by those who are in receipt of care, who see it as a very disempowering and disabling term in their lives. And then if we look at Irish language and the range of phrases and idioms that give us to enable us to talk about care, and I know it's a bit symbolic, the 32 words for field and the 40 words for green, but I do believe that we can have a much richer conversation about the different concepts of care and the relation to our lives in Irish than in English. So I do understand that, and I would wonder, the wonderful expression dios that you bring in from the Irish language to talk about post-growth, eco-social, donut economics, linear and circular economies, all of which do speak to the same thing, but all of which carry contestations across each other in terms of the nuance of meaning that are in. So I totally agree that that focus on paradigm change does require us to break open those cognitive locks. And I think you quoted and being locked into a social logic, Tim Jackson's language. And I think that's what we're all trying to do, is to open up those cognitive locks. And I think your three guardrails that you introduced, Dúchas, Pobal and Aisling, are really useful in that regard. And I wanted to just try and engage with them, because to me, you take them from the Irish language and how Dúchas opens up belonging and feeling and sentimentality in a really rich way. And I would see that coming through sociological literature, and for example, Hartman Rosa's concept of resonance, which really speaks to the intensity of emotion as well, and the richness of expression, the relationship to the world, and culturally distinctive worldviews. So I do think that, it's really interesting to engage across the critical theory into some of the concepts that you're bringing in from engaging with literature, that global to local comes in there as well. And I think if we look at feminism in that context, it really does give us a focus on effective, on moral rationalities. The flourishing of nature depends on the right use of power. You spoke to that very nicely. And to me, that really speaks to the principles of feminist leadership being a really important part of decolonisation debates, and that Oxfam, for example, will be bringing in to try and decolonise and localise their practice on the ground. So I think there's a lot of overlaps there. So too with Pobal, I think that focus on connectivity and collectivity and community, the importance of values and social roles, the different fields of knowledge. To my mind, that speaks really beautifully to feminist literatures on, for example, connective tissues, the importance of mutual interdependence. I really love that concept of no such thing as an individual endeavor. And I do think that it allows us to think differently about the very concept of possession and land and resources, and to go about it there. The last one that you spoke to was the Aisling and drawing on the utopian tradition. And again, I do think that concept of institutional imagination, I bring it in a lot when I'm talking about sort of the need for a care imaginary, for example, and thinking, breaking cognitive locks and how we understand how care can be met in the world. Welfare imaginaries. With a group of people, I'm involved in setting up an all-island social security network, and it is trying to promote the concept of a welfare imaginary for the island of Ireland, and insists that this is a way of bringing in class, a way of bringing in welfare issues into the debate about constitutional futures. And I think that's really important, to make sure that we're always bringing in the welfare dimension of what needs to be in that space. But Graeber and Wengrow talk about the freedom to reinvent us. And I think that's very much speaking to that utopian tradition, that people have always had the capacity to use culture, use arts, to really imagine living outside of those dominant paradigms, as you described it, and that we do need to be able to do that, to be able to really develop our imaginaries, if we are to be able to develop something that can lead us to an alternative world, an alternative paradigm. In my own work, I suppose you talk about sociability, and Clary's concept there as a really important way of fostering a culture of sociability. And I translate that possibly using feminist theory, but also welfare and critical theory. I focus that into reciprocity, a building up of the value of mutual interdependence and our reciprocal relationships, and indeed obligations to each other and to nature, to make this whole thing work as a collective whole. And that brings me into maybe a more practical policy agenda of universal basic services, of participation income, to socially value the types of reciprocal good we can be in each other's lives. So I think that there is a lot in how you unpacked those guardrails, as you call them, that can speak into critical theory, into feminist theory, and into some of the welfare theory that I think needs to be imagined and developed to make sure that the degrowth imaginaries or the degrowth utopians have enough substantial welfare in them to make sure that that agenda of equality, the agenda of meeting people's needs, the agenda of people's lives being able to have merit, the buen vivir, actually takes substance. So I think thank you for such a beautiful talk, Peadar, and I hope I've given some dimensions to it there in relating it to some of the literatures that I would engage with a genuine promise to try and be able to engage more with your literatures in time to come. Thank you.
Great. Gurmil Margaret Mary, thank you very, very much. And you've added some other dimensions to the discussion, which hopefully we'll be able to come back to before the close. But we want to move on to another response. On Ursula's Owen O'Quinagine. Owen is studying following a PhD in Sweden, in Linnaeus University. He's a decolonial scholar there, but he's also traveled widely in Africa and South America in his studies. So tugmid fóta ó in Arailat.
The Ivagarde an Gushen shiv me. Okay. Well, Tommy an sásta veg cur mo chuid taide cur lachar an seo agus veg lauert agus ag fragart there an tull of Peadar Kirby, who has interpreted various forms of the reformulation of imperial governments over the economy and nature over the last 3 decades. And he saw the inherent contradictions of the Celtic tiger and foresaw the vast inequality that it created from 2002 and also in 2008. In the Celtic Tiger in Distress, Professor Peadar Kirby finishes with the words that academics have a crucial role to play, yet far too much academic output in Ireland is functional to the persistence of a highly inequitable society and to the requirements of elites who benefit from it. So academics need to help empower the victims of this social order through exposing the way ideas prop it up and through mapping the parameters of a new social order. The existence of a vital democracy and a cohesive society requires nothing less. So in a minute or two, I'll just come back to this idea of empowerment. But firstly, I'd like to relate just how I started researching on the PhD and going back to Professor Kirby's analysis of the Celtic tiger. When in the 2008 crisis, I started to attend college, and I came out in the middle of austerity. So I then went over to the Netherlands, to Amsterdam, to look for work as an English teacher. Would you believe it? So in the Netherlands, in Amsterdam, students were occupying the university, and they were demanding decolonisation of the university. And this really got me inspired into thinking about this. And I saw this course on decolonising knowledge and power, which was in Barcelona, and it was run by a lot of Latin American and African thinkers on the subject of decolonisation. So I went to that, and after that, there was another school going on decolonisation by Walter Mignolo and Rolando Vasquez in the Netherlands. So from these points, I started to reassess, you know, the forms of Anglicization that I had gone through my own education in a society which constructs English as a supreme language, as the only way to access education and in Ireland. So it got me to think about this idea of indigenized, so that people become indigenous. People don't decide to become indigenous; they are indigenized through a process of land theft and through devaluation of their languages. And the summer schools that I went to, they emphasize decolonizing for and from. So who is doing the decolonizing and from where? So as a result of that, it led me to thinking about my own Irecht. So Irecht as a concept, it doesn't find an adequate translation in English, because there's no word that signifies a spatially situated relationship to both ancestors and future descendants at the same time. So Irecht could be translated as inheritance, ancestral heritage, but it also could be translated as legacy. So in this sense, it connects epistemic practices to the experiences of ancestors, but also knowing that one will become an ancestor and have future descendants. So therefore, when I went into the PhD, I started to think about how would I be able to draw on these concepts while studying the Gaelic song practitioners and Gaelic song, and how I could actually look at my own inheritance, my own Irecht, but also at the same time create a specific methodology and theoretical paradigm for my own research that would allow me to engage in the oral tradition and invoke songs to be able to read and respond to coloniality in Ireland. And I created this methodology that's inspired by a session, so that there's a democracy, and there's also an idea of emotion. The expression of emotion is very important for songing as a form of epistemic disobedience. So Irecht is one of the concepts, but we also have dúil, which is a form of desire, feeling, but it could also correspond to a listening positionality. And that with the objective of the research to attaining cuma, so that is a shape or an epistemic reconstitution, but also because when I began on the PhD, my Irish was not at a very good level at all. I started to engage in a relearning process. So I took my PhD as sort of an auto-ethnographical way to study how one would be able to engage with an ancestral language, and also speak to the coloniality that is pervasive. So there's other concepts that I could go into there, but I think it was very interesting the way that Professor Kirby used these concepts and integrated them into his talk. But I'd like to return to the idea of empowerment. So I think that when we're talking about empowerment, we have to look at also how the university in Ireland continually and is constructed on a disempowerment. The exteriorizing and delegitimizing of Indigenous knowledge and languages, what Sylvia Wynter calls the nature-culture mode of being, and the overrepresentation of Western and Anglicized ideas of nature, seeing it as nature as a tool for domination. The creation of the organizing principles and the logic of interventionism. So the non-human human divide that originally legitimized the intervention and in 1492, the civilizing mission, this kind of white saviorism that's still quite prevalent in the university, where white scholars study the people that need to be saved, the colonized, while they don't engage in their own Iirecht, they don't engage in their connecting to their own histories and ancestral legacies. And then the idea that's prevalent within this meeting today, which is the idea of development. So the idea, Sabelo and Lovo Gaceni and Ramon Grossfogel, they talk about discourses of development as construct as a logic of interventionism and a justification of the asymmetrical power relations created through colonialism. And as Peter Doran has also talked about, the involvement of universities in the plantation system. So I think that we also need to look at the epistemic extractivism that universities, especially in Ireland, with the concept of folklore, the folklorization of indigenized knowledge, locking people out of knowledge. As Martin O'Kine also talked about, the invocation of Irish as a symbolic power for the Irish Free State. So this idea of stockpiling indigenous knowledge, while also locking the epistemologies, relegating the epistemologies of singers and storytellers, I think should be key to a decolonial Gaelic or a decolonial Irish methodology. And I think I'd finish on the idea, speaking back to Professor Kirby's emphasis on empowerment, that a lot of that indigenized people have been fighting against many reformulations of imperialism for centuries from the beginning, and decolonial theory stresses that self-empowerment is key for decolonization, so there is a need for decolonial struggles to be led by the people who are actually colonized upon the land on which they stand. And I think I'd finish on the idea that Ireland is a plurilingual space. The idea of bilingualism also negates the travellers, the Minker and the language Cant and Gammon, which has also been inferiorized a lot through the colonial project and through the continuation of coloniality. So I think from my own project, drawing on Irish and song culture, invoking Indigenous language as epistemic practices, I try and speak back to these forms of epistemic colonialism. So hopefully we can continue some of those. But
thank you very much, Owen. This has been a very wide-ranging conversation so far, and very rich. We're going to have a few minutes of taking some ideas from the audience, or from the group, the wider group. I shouldn't say the audience. This is an interactive webinar, there's a few very interesting comments in the chat. If some of the people who've made comments are interested in speaking it briefly, maybe you could put your hands up and we can call on you if that's all right, or anybody else for that matter. And then what I suggest we do is we ask the speakers, the respondents, to respond if they'd like, if there's something they'd like to speak to. Barbara, why don't you go ahead?
Thank you very much. Yes, I've been urging for more ambition in the chat, because I see ecological collapse as very far advanced at the moment. So I would just like to qualify that I do have a vision of, I'd like to talk about ecological justice. None of the speakers so far have pointed out how unfair it is that we in the affluent world feel entitled to spend our money in ways that are very ecologically damaging. Our whole judicial system and our education system is designed to protect us with this entitlement. And I'm saying that if we do want to become sustainable, we will have to eliminate the huge ecological overshoot. And in order to do that, we will have to spend our money very, very differently. Going on a foreign holiday and many of our leisure pursuits just does not fit in to a society that wishes to become sustainable. So this is my contribution to the paradigm shift. Ecological justice.
Ecological justice, yes, indeed. Yeah, I think, I mean, I have heard some mention, maybe not the word justice, but some mention of that, but we'll see. John, you've got your hand up. You want to come in?
Yes, hi. Greetings, everybody from the north of the island, from County Down. Partly maybe picking up on what Barbara was saying, but the kind of caution against this kind of individualizing sense about what we can do as individuals. And again, it's an issue that hasn't been raised, but I certainly know that Peadar and Mary have written about this, is capitalism. You know, let's name the elephant in the system that has brought us to the brink of ecocide. And we do need to address the very, very difficult issue, how we challenge both ideologically and materially and politically this system that has been imposed on many people around the world, including ourselves. But of course, we have the collusion of our political and economic elite. So I would just ask for perhaps the three speakers to respond. What is the particular Irish decolonising response to capitalism? And if that isn't provocative enough, about whether or not we can do this while remaining part of the thoroughly neoliberal project that is the European Union. How difficult will it be to create an eco-social or eco-socialist Ireland within the context of essentially a constitutional EU project?
Thank you, John. Okay, I think I'll pass to the speakers now to see if there are any responses to either of those points that were raised about justice and about capitalism. I noticed, yes.
I'll take it up, John. Good to see you, as always. Very provocative. You in opening your comments, you seem to be making the point, which I do agree with, that there is a great danger in individualizing the challenge of what's facing us. So whatever label we put on it, ecological justice is one label. We need social justice. We need indeed justice for individuals who are suffering so desperately under the system. You ask, what's the distinctive Irish response to capitalism? I don't think there is a distinctive Irish response to capitalism. I think that, I mean, my take on Irish responses is that we have ways of engaging in the tasks that all of us have to do. And my three guardrails are an attempt to do that. And Owen very beautifully, I think, in his contribution, developed some of those beyond where I'd taken them to. So I think they give us resources, but different peoples and different, obviously, communities find the resources in different places. And the resources are to do the two things that I attributed to the Ashling tradition, which is that you can psychologically, as much as possible, disengage from the dominant system. I mean, of course, we can't completely disengage from the dominant system. From a young age, I used to try to turn off the ads on the radio when I was listening to news programs. That was an early attempt on my part to try to, well, be less influenced by the dominant system. So that's obviously one of the things, as I said, in outlining the Ashling tradition. The second then is to I mean, and this comes from the utopian tradition, to have the firm belief that transformation is possible and is going to come. Not in a naive sense, but in a sense that it's taking, I mean, again, back to Owen's point, it's taking back power into our own hands. And it's system change, not climate change. So it is changing the system. If you want to put the focus on capitalism, my problem with the term capitalism is that it means so many different things to so many different people. I would put the emphasis on the capital part of it rather than the ism part of it. And if we can become more aware of the extent to which our societies are run for the benefit of capital through the operations of capital, again, that becomes part of the challenge of trying to disengage from that and challenge it as much as possible, and try to live in practically sowing the seeds and the practice of what we do wherever we are doing it. And all of us have opportunities to do that, which are ensuring that they're contributing to the emergence of the new paradigm and as much as possible to weakening the dominant paradigm. That's capitalism, I agree with you. But I don't think the discourse about capitalism, it often muddies the water rather than really getting us to focus in on the essentials.
I agree. I think it's economic growth that's the problem.
It all depends how these things are defined, doesn't it? There's so much of it. Yes, I agree.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
I think you can get into a debate where, I mean, I would be inclined to say that it's systemic and that capitalism is overly focused on and so central to growth and profit making that it can't be done within the present understanding that we have of capitalism. I prefer to kind of look at it in political economy terms as what's the balance of state, society and market that we want in a post-growth society or world. And I think that, to my mind, then that means taking the market out as a main provider of means. And that to me means you end up going beyond capitalism. So I think no matter which logic you get there at. So I think if you want to get beyond commodification and if you want to get beyond consumerism as the main way we meet our needs, that you defocus the market and therefore you defocus capitalist systems and structures as the mechanisms for meeting our needs. And that means you return to quite strong states and very large societal reciprocal ways of meeting our needs. And I think that gives a more practical maybe route in to trying to imagine what a post-growth world is like, rather than is it or isn't it something. I think logically, if there's much less market and much more state and much more society, it is beyond capitalism that you end up in. Yeah.
Thanks, Mary. Owen, you've got your hand up now too. You want to say something?
I just want to respond there to the question briefly, and I would just say that capitalism, European accumulation doesn't happen without colonialism, and the invasion of the Americas in 1492. So with Cedric Robinson, we're living in racial capitalism. So unless there's an anti-racist movement that's involved, also orientated towards coalition, entering in people studying Irish language and culture and song and decolonial movements, putting themselves into spaces where there's colonized people from all around the world, and they talk together about how they build an anti-racist decolonial movement based on improving the lives of Indigenous people. And then finally, I would just say that the practice of singing songs can also be seen as an anti-capitalist act within Ireland through Irish, creating an autonomous zone of freedom, which creates an interruption and a moment of disruption of colonial violence. So I think that is fundamentally an anti-capitalist movement as well.
Thank you, Owen. We're going to just move to, I'm going to invite my colleague from the Hub, Kevin Murphy, just to say a few words about his work in the Derry Playhouse, which brings in a lot of the themes that we've been talking about. So if you're there, Kevin, I'll pass to you for a minute.
Did I have a sense that Caitlin might have been speaking first?
She's been having internet difficulties, unfortunately. So yeah, sorry about that.
No, that's okay. I just didn't want to jump in the wrong space. So I suppose I partly am thinking about the Northern Ireland perspective in relation to the Irish language. And of course, as the other smaller jurisdiction within this island, it's interesting to think about the politically charged aspect of the language here in Northern Ireland as part of this conversation. So the return to, I suppose, what is, as you rightly point out, a minority language, but I guess on this island, a majority cultural root. That's a very interesting space for Irish language to be in. But when we think of it from a point of view now, there are, of course, many other minority languages that are spoken on the island. And so it's very much more about a plurality, I guess, now. So even when we think back to people talk a lot about Field Day, for example, in Derry, which is really going back to the 1980s. And when you think of the resonance of Brian Friel's play Translations, which of course was the first production that Field Day put on, and the power of that production, in and of itself, it talks to a lot of the themes that are here today. But I suppose, and I guess it's a good reference point for how we might deal with lots of different minority cultures and languages now. We need to think, we need to learn from the fact of what we understand from Irish language in reflection against this dominant colonial language that we've referred to quite a lot. And also now what people hear, the increasingly diverse sets of languages that are here in the island of Ireland. I think we have to think about that. But then if I talk a little bit about the arts, what occurs to me is that is writing, if you like, or writing in the language, or speaking in different languages, or speaking creatively through poetry or plays or other means of cultural expression. There are two worlds that it inhabits. There's an inner world as well as the outer world. And we've been talking a bit about both, but a lot of what we're focused on now is the world that we live in, the outer world. And we're talking about the concept of degrowth. But in the arts is a world that has limited resources, but operates in a world of abundance. So the question from the artist, I guess, is what is it that we would seek to grow rather than what is it we would seek to have less of? And even though we need a little bit of both of those things, I wondered whether there was anything in that inner and outer world. As I wonder whether the gaze should in some ways go inwards, even though that we do that individually, but at the same time, maybe as a society, perhaps there's something about the inner world that needs to be nurtured so that things can flourish better in the outer world. And I guess the other thing is about the process of making art. There are normally more than two things involved, so it's a self-reflective thing in one sense. So there's your own kind of relationship with a piece of art that you're creating, but there's also the relationship with the people that you share with it, share the art with. So there is something about having more than two things, three being quite a good number to start with. So you're the knowing. You're the knower, and what you're looking at, the object is the known, and then there's the process of knowing in between. And that space in between seems to be very relevant in relation to art, but also in relation to language, especially when we're talking about this, the bits in between seem to be where the growth, if I go back to that, and abundance might be. So I guess I'm curious about that idea of how we might talk about what we want to grow more effectively, what it is we would seek to flourish, rather than only, I'm not saying we're doing that here, but there's definitely a sense that we're focusing on what needs to degrow, whereas actually it might be more helpful to think about what it is that needs to grow in order for things to flourish a little bit better. And then the other experience that's here in Northern Ireland, I think it's worth talking about is, and Peadar referred to it, that trauma, if you like, from the wound of the language being put into ignored or put down or blocked or ridiculed. And so that sense of how we deal with conflict and trauma as a result of these kinds of brutal activities. And obviously the arts and other sectors in Northern Ireland have had a long experience now of working out how do we deal with trauma and how do we work through that to a point where there is a sense of healing and possibility. And inevitably that what the arts does in that space is simply to create the space. Again, going back to this idea of a more abundant space, but a space that is safe, space where you can have dialogue, where your language or identity is welcome enough that you can feel that you can express yourself. And then if that space is created, then rather than having a specific agenda around things, there is the possibility that people will come to greater understanding, that they will develop empathies that otherwise they would not have had towards other people. And then through that process, there's a possibility at very least to open out towards something that's a more hopeful outcome. And then the other critiques I might offer just very briefly are, of course, art as a sector is being influenced by this whole monoculturalism and consumerism. And it is often used as a vehicle or as a tool, rather blunt tool, and sometimes for this dominant paradigm that we're seeking to change. So art is no different in that sense, or art making, and certainly as a sector, it's been guilty of that, I think. And then I suppose the last thing that strikes me around that is that within that, human creative expression naturally is less kind of monocultural. If you go beyond the professional art sector, or if you scratch the surface of any community, human expression is alive and well, human creative expression is alive and well. And so it in and of itself tends towards a plurality. It tends towards, certainly in the aggregate, it does anyway. And so there's a great deal of hope and creativity because, as I say, it's a resource that we don't lack, nor will we ever likely run out of. But at the same time, it tends towards the diversity that we really need. So if we want abundance, we must have diversity. I think somebody said something about, if I can find it in the little bits of notes, I said, biodiversity, I think it might have been Peadar, needs linguistic diversity. So I think it's quite a powerful statement, actually. And I think abundance, if we were to talk about that, is an absolute fundamental, requires diversity. There can't be any abundance if there's no diversity. But maybe the opposite is true also.
Great, Gurmina Margaret, Shin Kevin, thanks very much indeed. So Barvarling Dollarashkadi on Tuberanish a father. I want to go back to the well for water, and perhaps reflecting on what's gone on tonight. And there are some new ideas, I think, that have been thrown at you. I'd love to hear your reaction. And personally, just looking at the evolution of the evening for me, so we have had a reasonable amount of Irish, but in actual fact, the real discussion takes place in English, and it's probably normal. And probably if we let it go on, if we didn't make a big effort, it would all be in English. So Baralam the Horimi Ershin, and what would be the ways forward? So how can we, if you like, be the catalysts for this paradigm shift that we're talking about? Because it's more like a revolution than an evolution, I think we're talking about. So over to you, Peadar.
Because Captain Gumil, Tubber Misha, Better Gumil on Tubber Follow, we know Misha, Acharennos. Captain McGrevin Cora on Spragoil, on Sever, on Yahan. When my sortan of us an rudder door to own a Kahira, K nor Williams Geminche Annam new mar olive, Moss olive me is ear olive me. Ach Hook session Lergus is doch quid than stuff of Emisha Giri Yanov. Is leerwe astolium on Tavachta on sort chasavamach as na disciplini agus as na queer quiga via na disciplini or father via na gwinga agus Kangalienov Ladini Eachan an sale tri lunsi oiraha agur federal sort chasavamoy that's na lunsi shin. I thought that Mary's contribution was particularly rich from that point of view, and I found it very, very interesting, the connections that she made from her world of endeavor and indeed down to very words. I think it shows the rich possibilities if we really take language more seriously. It is, of course, one of the great, really, really huge crises of our times, is the impoverishment of language at all levels, and particularly in public life. So my reflections are that I think it's been a really rich series of reflections that have raised many issues, that have opened possibilities for showing the ways in which, by re-engaging with our native language, that there are possibilities there that greatly facilitate the ability to step outside the dominant paradigm imaginatively, challengingly, and to find there really rich resources that help us to do the two things that I think are essential. Number one, to distance ourselves imaginatively in our ways of thinking from the control that the dominant paradigm is all the time exercising on us. And the second thing is to really embody a hope, not necessarily an optimism, but a hope that transformation is underway. And those that mist, as Pope Francis put it in the long quote I read from him, that's seeping out from under the door, that door needs to be opened, and we need to step into this richer, more integral humanity that is calling us forward. But by golly, it's not going to happen without huge struggles. So gur míle maithagh as an deise huair domsa na smaointe a chuir le chéile gur chuir mé le chéile, thóg sé mise caiith mé admháil ar bhealach nach raibh mé a smaoinemh le go dóchadh sé mé, má thuigeann sibh mé, sé sin threoraigh sé mé ar bhealach chun rudí aimsiú is síoch na Gaeilge, agus dínta é sin, agus beidir gur féidir liomsa níos má scríomh faoi sin amachchan seo, pobl, dúchas, aisling, agus focail eile an sin éireacht an focail an tábhachtach a chuir óan sa stig sa córa freisin. Mar sin gnéirí libh go leanamh sé raig leis an gcórá leis an saoilú as an nua agus dóchas, fíor dóchas a bheith going gohfuilimid ar an mealach seo I dro paradigm nua nó béascan na nua mar is fear liomsa rá agus go bhfuil golóir severus golóir rudaí le tuairtling le chun cabhrúling ar an mealach seo. Íomh.
Thank you very much, Peadar. And thank you so much to everybody. We're going to wind up in a minute now because we're nearly at the end of the time. I found this a very interesting conversation. I'm going to have to go back and listen to it again because there's too much density in there. I'm going to have to go back and concentrate on every word. We are planning our next step as a hub is that we're going to have a deep dive workshop in Clough Jordan in the Eco Village in July, and we're going to bring together some artists, activists and academics to discuss all of these issues further. And we'd really love to keep you all in the loop. If you're interested in keeping track of what we're doing, we have a mailing list, and I'm just going to put the link in the chat here, which you can sign up to. And we also have a web page, so I put that in the chat as well. So thank you all very much for joining us. I'm going to hand over to Sean now to say a final goodbye.
My final couple of focal, well, the soccer Milmaga the father, just want to thank Peadar, and especially what maybe you didn't catch, the English speakers didn't catch there, but he was saying that the experience stimulated him in his preparation, and then also in some of the ideas that were thrown out tonight. And certainly from my point of view, I think a little bit more digging on our part is going to be needed. There's some lovely ideas in the chat there, and maybe we do need to think about some of those words that Peadar used that are lovely in Irish. And I finally want to leave you with a thought. I never thought when I sing an Irish song that I was actually singing against colonialism, but I do it all the time. So next time, and I mentioned I'll be singing on Pucker Buile in a pub to an international audience in a couple of nights' time. It's a forestry conference. I'll be thinking of you, Owen. So on that note, Iava Kolosov agus gur mil magal vas vet part of sin webinar. Slán.